Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is Sondra Oster Baras, and we are on part two of our three-part series, The Prophet and the Leader. The first part, we talked about Eli and his encounter with two different prophets who prophesied to him that his descendants would no longer be high priests and how he accepted or responded to that. In contrast to the way we see Eli accepting the word of God on this very painful issue, today we are going to talk about a very different kind of political figure, Saul. Saul, of course, receives the word from Samuel that he too will lose the kingdom. His descendants will not continue to be king after him. And his response is very different. He does not accept it, and we see he continues to pursue David, who Samuel anoints as king, initially in quiet. Saul doesn't know necessarily that Samuel has anointed David as king, but he sees David as a threat and tries to kill him and pursues him for years. And that, of course, leads to Saul's own very tragic ending. So what I'd like to do is take a look at Saul. How does he start and where does he end up and how did he get there? And I think that will give us a lot of insight as well as to how he received the prophecy from Samuel, very much reflective in what happens in his own character development. So we first meet Saul at the beginning of chapter 9 at 1 Samuel. And the introduction of Saul is actually extremely positive and very impressive, actually. And I will read you from the English. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Tzor, son of Bechurat, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of substance. Okay, the man of substance, I'm not sure if I would actually translate it that way. The word in Hebrew is Gibor Chayil, and that would mean a very brave man, a man who would be a military man, a person who would be necessarily not a military man, but has that ability, the strength and the courage of a military man. He had a son whose name was Saul, an excellent young man. No one among the Israelites was better than he. Now, in my English, it says was handsomer than he, but actually the same word tov is used to describe him in the previous line, an excellent young man. No one is better than him. That's far more accurate. He was a head taller than any of the people. Now, he certainly was handsome. He was very tall, but in this verse, we are told something about his quality. He's an excellent young man. He is good, okay? And then we learn about, of course, this man, though, is not king. He's just an ordinary man, comes from a fine family, from the tribe of Benjamin. And we learn a very mundane sort of story. Donkeys. His father lost some donkeys, and he sends his son. He says to his son, Saul, please go and find the donkeys. Son, take this servant boy with you and go together to find the donkeys. And they set off, and they're looking, and they don't find them, and they're about to turn back. And the servant boy then says to Saul, hey, wait, you know what? I hear, and this is in goes further on. He says, the servant says, verse 6, there's a man of God in that town. And he suggests, let's go. There's a prophet, which right here is called a seer, S-E-E-R, someone who sees, who can see into the future. Very interesting. And that's how it was. In fact, we will see later on in Scripture, a few verses later, we learn that in this time, the prophet is actually referred to as a seer. Now, earlier on, when we met the prophet who comes to Eli, we heard a prophet refers to as a man of God. So these are just various terms that are being used during these ancient times to refer to a prophet. Anyway, so it is the servant boy who suggests to Saul, why don't we go find the prophet? I have a bit of money. We can pay him, and then he'll tell us what we don't know. He'll tell us where the donkeys are. So they make a plan. They go, and they're about to go to the prophet, who is Samuel. Okay? Now, this whole story happens just after a meeting between the nation and Samuel, where the nation has said to Samuel, you know what, we want a king. You're a nice guy. We like you. You've been a wonderful leader. You've been a wonderful prophet, but we want a real king. We want to be like all the other nations. And Samuel, of course, is very disappointed. He tries to discourage them from this idea, but they are absolutely firm. They really want to have a king. And this is at the end of chapter 8. At the end, he goes to God, and God responds to him. The Lord said to Samuel, "Heed their demands and appoint a king for them." Samuel then said to the men of Israel, "All of you go home." So in other words, it becomes very clear to Samuel that regardless of what he thinks, God has agreed that he needs to do this. At this point, of course, he has no idea who that king is going to be, but this is what immediately comes before this story. Okay, now, so Samuel's going Saul's looking for Samuel, and then we learn as follows, and we're still in chapter 9, verse 15. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed the following to Samuel. "At this time tomorrow I will send a man to you from the territory of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him ruler of my people." Okay? And very, very important to pay attention to what the wording is here in Hebrew. The nation asked to receive a king, which in Hebrew is a melech. And here, God is saying to Samuel, anoint this man, Saul, as a ruler. The word in Hebrew is a nagid. So it's two separate things. They ask for a king. God says, appoint a ruler. Okay? And then, of course, it becomes clear to Samuel. God reveals himself to Samuel that when Saul approaches him, asking him for his donkeys, that this indeed is the person he's supposed to appoint as a ruler. And he then in the beginning of chapter 10, he actually anoints Samuel. And again, he anoints him as a ruler, not as a king. Okay? There's a great deal of promise in all of this. And what's so impressive here about Saul, he's clearly a very tall man, a very dignified person, and yet he's incredibly modest. He says to Samuel when he first says to him, you're going to be king. He says, "Me, I'm just a Benjamite. I'm from this smallest tribe. What does this have to do with me?" He's not looking for this at all. In fact, this is a classic case that very often we talk about. Here's the man who went looking for donkeys and he found kingship. It was the last thing in his mind when he went to look for Samuel. All he was looking for was his donkeys. And of course, one of the things that Samuel tells him is, "Don't worry, the donkeys have been found. Your father has the donkeys already, so you don't have to be stressed." Anyway, there's a number of things that happen after that. Samuel gives him a number of signs by which he knows that indeed this prophecy is true. And what we read in chapter 10, verse 10, that at some point it says, "The Spirit of God gripped him, and he began to prophesy." Okay, so Saul then is not just a king, but he has received the Spirit of God upon him, which is something very, very special. Okay, then Samuel brings him wants to kind of announce this to everybody, and he has representatives of all the tribes gathered together, and he wants to present Saul. Here's the new ruler. Okay, and they can't find him. So they say, has anybody, where is he? Anybody know who he is? And Samuel turns to God. He says, has anyone else come here? And he says, where is Samuel? And the Lord replied, "Yes, he is hiding among the baggage." This is a fellow, Saul, who is not looking for honor, and when honor chases him, he runs away. He's hiding. So they ran over and brought him there, and when he took his place among the people, he stood a head taller than all the people. And Samuel said to the people, "Do you see the one whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people." And all the people acclaimed him, shouting, "Long live the king." Okay, Samuel and God appointed him as a ruler. To the nation, this is fulfilling what they had asked for. They wanted a king. They wanted to be like everyone else. And so they say, "Long live the king." This has not yet penetrated Saul. Okay? How do we know he doesn't act like a king yet? Because in verse 26, we see that Saul goes to his house, to the Gibeah. He doesn't build a palace. He doesn't establish a capital. He goes home. He goes to where he always was. And basically, from this point on, for another chapter or two, a few chapters, we see that he just acts as a leader who God has appointed, and where he can help, he does. And he follows battle, he fights battles, and he protects the nation from various enemies that come around him. And of course, more and more people are very excited by Saul because they see him as someone who God has appointed to lead them and to save them. Okay? But then we have the first sign of trouble, and this is in chapter 13, where there's a great victory, and Saul is going to offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God, and it is Samuel who is supposed to actually offer the sacrifice. Now let us remember that Samuel himself is a priest, okay? And it's part of his role. And don't forget, even though there's no longer a tabernacle at this point, he has in fact inherited the role of Eli, the high priest. He himself has the ability as a priest to bring sacrifices. That is not the job of a king. A king is not supposed to bring sacrifices. A prophet or a priest is supposed to bring sacrifices, and that's the arrangement. Saul is going to gather the people, and it is Samuel who's going to be the sacrifices. And Samuel is late, or Saul doesn't understand that he maybe misunderstood the time. So Saul he's worried that the people are going to disperse. This is in chapter 13, and so he brings the sacrifice himself. Samuel comes and is very upset. He says, "Why didn't you wait for me?" And he sees this as a very, very major mistake, or even sin, that Saul has done in not waiting and sacrificing himself and not waiting for Samuel. And as a result, Samuel says, "But now your dynasty will not endure." And here he uses the word kingdom. No more ruler here, okay? Kingdom. "The Lord will seek out a man after his own heart, and the Lord will appoint him ruler over his people, because you did not abide by what the Lord has commanded you." And I think we see here an interplay between the use of king and the use of ruler. I think here what Samuel is trying to say, what was the problem in not waiting for Samuel? It was just a misunderstanding of time. Why is that such a big deal? But in taking the reins of bringing the sacrifice, Saul began to act like a king in the negative sense of the word. In Judaism, there's a separation of powers. The king does one thing and the priest does something else. In fact, we see kings later on who sin because they usurped the rights and responsibilities of the priest. A king rules politically, and a priest or a prophet have various spiritual roles, and one should not be usurping the role of the next. Okay, so this is very possibly, and right here, if we are very careful with what Samuel says, he says, your kingship will not endure, okay? And the Lord will appoint him ruler. In other words, you set up a kingship. You were supposed to stay as a ruler. You set up a kingship. You became a little bit too arrogant, and God doesn't like that. So he's going to remove this from you, and instead he's going to find someone else who will be a ruler. Okay? We don't see much of a response from Saul at that point. Okay? And then we move on. There's a number of additional battles that are fought and victories. And after another victory in chapter 14, we see another verse. Then Saul set up an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar he erected to the Lord. So here, in a sense, we see that he ignored completely Samuel's rebuke. It wasn't enough that then he just didn't wait for Samuel, but it was not his own altar. Here he goes even further, usurping the roles of the priest, and he is building his own altar. This is certainly not something that a king should do. But again, this is written in a very subtle way here in chapter 14. Where do we get, of course, the big explosion? Chapter 15. Here Samuel comes back to Saul and tells him, you have a command. You need to seek out Amalek and destroy them, all of them. You need to destroy the leadership, and you need to destroy all the people and all the animals and everything. You just have to wipe out Amalek. And of course, this is in obedience to the original command to the nation of Israel in Deuteronomy to totally wipe out any memory of Amalek, because this is an evil nation. It's the first nation that attacked the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt right after the parting of the Red Sea, and they continue to be a very problematic nation in the land of Israel as well. Okay, so Saul goes to battle. He defeats them, no problem, amazing victory. But what happens? First of all, he destroys only the bad livestock. The good livestock he keeps. And he also, and now I'm reading from chapter 15, verse 9, but Saul and the troops spared Agag. Now that's the English, but again, this is not an accurate translation. In Hebrew, the word is vayachmol. Saul took pity on Agag, okay, and the best of the sheep, and all else that was of value. They would not prescribe them. They prescribed only what was cheap and worthless. So already you have here, like, what exactly is going on? Why was it so important that Saul keep all this? He didn't want the bad livestock. He wants the good livestock. You begin to wonder what actually is going on here. And you have reason to suspect, a suspicion that I think is absolutely confirmed afterwards when you see how Samuel responds to Saul. A suspicion that what Saul is looking for is a victory parade, a victory celebration. He envisions bringing major sacrifices to God, not just take a little something, a quiet little sacrifice. He wants a major tribute to God, okay? And we see this as we move on in the chapter, verse 11, when God says to Samuel, why is he upset with Saul? This is what he says. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from me and has not carried out my commands. Now, and we see immediately Samuel's response. Samuel was distressed, and he entreated the Lord all night long. So it's clear that whatever Samuel had said to Saul before, that his kingship would not continue, that was maybe it's possibly something that could have been changed. Maybe it wasn't quite as drastic as it sounded. But here it's clear that Samuel is extremely distressed because he understands that this time God is very serious. And so he prays to God all night long to try to change his mind about Saul. Early in the morning, but he fails. Early in the morning, Samuel went to meet Saul. Samuel was told, Saul went to Carmel, where he erected a monument for himself. Then he left and went down to Gilgal. So what we said before about keeping all the sheep, it's borne out in the text, because someone says, what? Saul has already erected a monument for himself. Where's that quiet little fellow who hid among the baggage because he didn't want to become king? Now, after being given a victory that clearly was thanks to God, not only thanks to Saul's wisdom, why is he erecting a monument to himself? What arrogance does that reflect? And then we continue. Samuel, of course, meets Saul and rebukes him. And what does he say to him? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission, saying, go and destroy the sinful Amalekites. Make war on them until you have exterminated them. Why did you disobey the Lord and swoop down on the spoil? He kept the good stuff in defiance of the Lord's will. And so Saul argues with Samuel. He says, but I did obey the Lord. I performed the mission. I captured King Agag, and I prescribed to Amalek, and the troops took from the spoil some sheep and oxen, the best of what had been, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And then what does Sam say? And don't forget to sacrifice in Gilgal. But before he went to Gilgal, he had already been in Carmel to erect a monument. So there's something not so honest about Saul's response to Samuel. And what does Samuel say to him? He says, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much in obedience to the Lord's command? And I think in this sense, he's also suspicious. He says, you know what? Fine, you say you want to sacrifice to God. But are you trying to sacrifice to God, or are you trying to create a whole display? You put up a memorial. Now you're going to go to Gilgal, which is the place where he was actually anointed king, in a big production and a coronation. Not the original one when he's hiding, but later on when he's already king and he wants to be anointed king. There's this transition that's going on. And of course, it continues to say the actual punishment is of course very severe, because it is this point that Samuel says to Saul, I will not go back with you, for you have rejected the Lord's command, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. The Lord has this day torn the kingship over Israel away from you and has given it to another who is worthier than you. Keep in mind here, we're not talking about a ruler, we are talking about kingship. Okay, so we have a separate progression going on here. Saul, who begins as a modest man who wants to do what he can to help Israel, suddenly it all goes to his head. The nation said, long live the king, and he says, I'm a king. Isn't that great? Let me act like a king. Well, this is exactly the behavior that Samuel was afraid of and that God does not want. A king is there to serve the nation, to serve God. But when kingship goes to his head and he's putting up memorials and he's setting up altars, he's usurping the role of the priest, and at the same time he's doing things that just go to the glory of his kingship instead of to the glory of God, what God really wants. God wants obedience. He doesn't want big spectacular celebrations and sacrifices. As soon as that happens, we see that Saul has literally lost it. Now, at this point is the point of test, of true test. Is Saul going to accept this like Eli does and says that God will do what he knows best, or is he going to fight it? And at this point is that we see Saul fights it terribly, because after this, David comes to Saul as just a young shepherd boy who helps him kill Goliath, and then he plays instruments and he soothes Saul's soul. Wow, that was a word. But then all of a sudden Saul begins to see him as a threat, and it gets to a point where he decides that's it. He's going to kill Saul, and he's going to kill Saul. Decides he's going to kill David. David, in the meantime, has already been anointed by Samuel to be the next king, but Saul doesn't know that. David keeps that to himself. David doesn't act in any way to indicate that he is seeking to replace Saul, but Saul in his paranoia, Saul in his bad spirit that has come over him, in contrast to that wonderful spirit of God that comes over him initially when he first meets Samuel, just after he first meets Samuel. Suddenly we have a bad spirit coming over Saul, and he chases David from one end of the country to the other. David is forced to leave. David is forced to do all kinds of things just to survive. And at the end, of course, Saul meets a very, very tragic death. As he's fighting the Philistines, he is killed. Well, he's about to be killed by the Philistines, and so he actually falls on his own sword to prevent himself being killed by the Philistines. And when the Philistines find him and his sons who have been dead, they take their heads and they put them on the walls of the city of Beit-Shan in a very bold and nasty gesture of mocking the king of Israel. And it's a very, very terrible moment for the people of Israel, but it's also a very terrible moment for Saul. It's such a tragedy. I once heard a beautiful thought from one of my teachers, and I want to share it with you. What would have happened had Saul just accepted that he was wrong and that he has done what he has done? God had never said he was going to kill Saul prematurely. He says he's going to move his kingship to somebody else. David would then take over. If he had just accepted that, what could have happened? Now, in the early days, when Saul and David are still on good terms, Saul gives David his daughter, Michal, as a wife. Now, of course, there's tremendous tragedy in that relationship, because when initially, of course, Michal is very devoted to David, and when he has to sneak out of the palace and escape from Saul, Michal helps him do that. But something happens along the way, and Michal becomes very bitter against David, and she clearly becomes more closely identified with the house of Saul, her father, the king, not with her husband, who then becomes king, David. Okay, and we see this really come to a head in 2 Samuel chapter 6 when David brings up the ark to Jerusalem, and Michal, his wife, is watching out from the window, and she makes fun of him. And why does she make fun of him? David, in his first attempt to bring up the ark, does it with tremendous pomp and circumstance, and things go wrong. They bring the ark up on a wagon, and whatever. That's a whole separate story to be analyzed, but things go terribly wrong. The second time that David brings him up, he learns his lesson, and he dresses very simply. He's not out there in royal robes. He's dressing simply, and the ark is being carried on the shoulders, and he dances before the ark in total submission to God. Well, this is what Michal doesn't like, because she wants her husband to act like a king, like her father Saul, not like David is acting. But this is exactly what Saul did wrong. When you act as a king and you take powers and arrogance to yourself, you forget that you are there to serve God. And David, in his whole demeanor, as he's bringing up the ark the second time, he's all about serving God. He as a king is not important. He is dancing before the ark to serve God. And this is what Michal doesn't like. And how do we read this at the end? Michal, it was before the Lord, David answered Michal when she mocks him. It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family, and appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. And again, here we use the word ruler, not king. Okay, I will dance before the Lord and dishonor myself even more and be low in my own esteem, but among the slave girls that you speak of, I will be honored. So to her dying day, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children. A tragedy in its own right. What could have happened had Saul been different? Had Saul educated his family and his daughter differently? If Saul had behaved as a ruler with modesty and understanding his role to serve God and to serve the people and not to be this arrogant king, what could have happened? Even though he had sinned, he had made a mistake, whatever, maybe his son would not have been king. David would have been king. But David was married to his daughter Michal. And if David and Michal had had children, those children would have been not only from the house of David and would have become king of Israel. One of the children would become king of Israel. But that means that would have been one of Saul's grandchildren who would have also been king of Israel. In other words, initially, Saul himself may not have continued with a direct descendant of his becoming king, but had all of these mistakes and sins not happened, it would have still come together. Saul would have had a future. At least his descendants could have had a future. But he rejected all of this. He rejected what Samuel was telling him about the kingdom moving to somebody else. He refused to accept it. He fought it and even tried to kill David, who had already been anointed to be his successor. What a different way of accepting. This is not someone who's accepting God. What a terrible fall we see in Saul from that young, modest man who was not looking for kingdom, but just for his donkeys, until someone who lets the whole position of kingdom change him terribly and create his arrogance and enables him to lose sight of what his real goal is. Saul remained a very strong and faithful believer in God, but he failed to understand what his role needed to be as a ruler of Israel. Have a wonderful evening. This is Sondra Oster Baras bringing you some Bible from the heart of biblical Israel. Have a great night. Bye-bye.